Have you ever wondered about the real man behind the most terrifying vampire in literary history? The truth is, Vlad Dracula was far more horrifying than any fictional monster could ever be. While Bram Stoker's Count Dracula merely drank blood, the real Dracula impaled thousands of his enemies on wooden stakes and left them to die in agony for days. But here's what's truly chilling. Everything you think you know about this medieval ruler is just the beginning of a story so brutal, so calculated, and so psychologically twisted that it makes modern horror films look like children's fairy tales. Today, I'm going to reveal the true story of Vlad the Impaler, a man who turned torture into an art form and psychological warfare into a science. We'll explore how a young hostage became the most feared ruler in medieval Europe, why he chose impalement as his signature method of execution, and how his reign of terror was so effective that it literally changed the course of history. But first, let me show you just how real this story gets. Because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the Ottoman Sultan who conquered Constantinople himself retreated in horror when he saw what Vlad had done. This isn't just another vampire story. This is the biography of a man who killed over 80,000 people, created forests of impaled corpses that stretched for miles, and whose psychological tactics were so brutal that they're still studied by military strategists today. And the most terrifying part? Everything he did for a reason. The man who would become known as Vlad the Impaler was born between 1428 and 1431 inches, the fortified Saxon town of Sighișoara, Transylvania, in a 3-story stone house where his father had taken refuge. His birth name was Vlad III, but he would inherit a far more ominous title from his father, Dracula, meaning son of the dragon or son of the devil, depending on how you interpret the ancient Romanian language. His father, Vlad II Dracul, had earned the name Dracul through his membership in the Order of the Dragon, a militant brotherhood founded by the King of Hungary, and dedicated to stopping the Ottoman Empire's relentless expansion into Christian Europe. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Vlad's childhood wasn't spent learning courtly manners or studying Latin poetry. Instead, he was raised in a world where survival meant understanding that power could only be maintained through fear, where political alliances shifted like quicksand, and where a single miscalculation could result in your entire family being tortured to death by your enemies. His mother's identity remains unknown to this day, but he was raised alongside his brothers Mircea and Radu by his stepmother, Princess Kneazna of Moldavia, in a household that was constantly under threat from rival noble families and foreign invaders. The defining moment of Vlad's childhood came when he was just 11 years old. In 1442, his father made a catastrophic political miscalculation that would shape Vlad's entire worldview and set him on the path to becoming one of history's most brutal rulers. Vlad II Dracul had failed to support an Ottoman invasion of Transylvania, and Sultan Murad II demanded immediate proof of his loyalty. The price? His 2 youngest sons would be sent to the Ottoman court as hostages. Imagine being 11 years old and suddenly finding yourself hundreds of miles from home, surrounded by the enemies of your people, knowing that your life depends entirely on your father's political decisions. Vlad and his younger brother Radu were imprisoned in the Egrigos fortress in Anatolia, where they remained in service of the Sultan court, a diplomatic phrase that meant they were living bargaining chips whose throats could be cut at any moment if their father stepped out of line. The psychological impact of this captivity cannot be overstated. While Vlad and Radu received an excellent education in science, philosophy, and the arts, and while Vlad became a skilled horseman and warrior, every single day was a reminder that they were prisoners, their lives hung by a thread. And that thread was controlled by the same empire that was systematically conquering and enslaving Christian Europe. The pain of this separation is captured perfectly in a letter Vlad's father wrote to the Senate of Brasov in 1444. "I left my little children to be slaughtered for the peace of Christians." But here's what makes this story even more tragic, and what explains so much about Vlad's later brutality. In 1444, their father supported a Christian crusade against the Ottomans, fully expecting that his sons would be executed in retaliation. Vlad II Dracul was convinced that his 2 boys would be butchered for the sake of Christian peace. They survived, but the knowledge that their own father had been willing to sacrifice them for political gain left scars that would never heal. The brothers responded to their captivity in completely different ways, and this difference would eventually lead to a conflict that would define Vlad's entire reign. Radu adapted to Ottoman culture, eventually converting to Islam and becoming a favorite of the Sultan. But Vlad seethed. Every day of his captivity, every lesson in Ottoman customs, every moment of forced respect for his captors fed a rage that would eventually explode across Eastern Europe like a plague. While Vlad was learning to survive in the Ottoman court, back home in Wallachia, his family was being systematically destroyed. In 1447, John Hunyadi, the regent governor of Hungary, who suspected Vlad's father of secretly supporting the Ottomans, invaded Wallachia with devastating consequences. During the brutal winter campaign, Vlad II Dracul was captured and killed. But that wasn't enough for Vlad's enemies. His eldest brother, Mircea, was captured by their political rivals, and what happened next reveals the level of brutality that was considered normal in medieval Romanian politics. Mircea was first blinded, his eyes were gouged out while he was still alive. Then, in a display of cruelty that would have impressed even the most sadistic Ottoman executioner, he was buried alive by the citizens of Târgoviște. The very people his family had ruled turned against him, shoveling dirt onto his face while he screamed for mercy that would never come. When news of these murders reached Vlad in his Ottoman prison, something fundamental broke inside him. The 11-year-old boy who had been sent away as a hostage was gone forever. In his place was someone who understood that mercy was weakness, that fear was power, and that anyone who threatened his rule would suffer consequences so terrible that others would think twice before crossing him. The Ottomans, perhaps recognizing that they had created a monster, released Vlad in 1448 and helped him claim the throne of Wallachia. They probably thought they were installing a puppet ruler, someone who had been raised in their culture and would govern according to their interests. They could not have been more wrong. Vlad's first reign lasted only 2 months before he was overthrown by his cousin Vladislav II. But even in that brief period, he had already begun to demonstrate the ruthless efficiency that would make him legendary. For the next 8 years, Vlad fought a brutal campaign to reclaim his throne, moving between Hungary and Moldavia, building alliances, gathering resources, and planning his return. During this period, he learned the political and military lessons that would serve him for the rest of his life. He studied the weaknesses of his enemies, the loyalty of his allies, and most importantly, the power of reputation. By the time he was ready to make his move in 1456, Vlad had already decided that his rule would be different from any that had come before. When Vlad finally reclaimed the throne of Wallachia in 1456 with Hungarian support, he was no longer the traumatized child who had been sent away as a hostage. He was a calculating, brilliant, and utterly ruthless political operator who understood that in a world where might made right, the only way to survive was to become more terrifying than anyone else dared to be. And what he did next would shock even the most hardened warriors of medieval Europe. The consolidation of power that followed would become the stuff of nightmares. Vlad knew that his authority would be immediately challenged by the same noble families who had murdered his father and brother. These boyars, as they were called, controlled vast estates and private armies, and they had grown accustomed to treating the throne of Wallachia as their personal plaything, installing and removing rulers whenever it suited their interests. They expected the young prince to be grateful for their support and to govern according to their wishes. They were about to discover just how catastrophically they had misjudged him. What happened next demonstrates the calculated brilliance of Vlad's approach to psychological warfare. Rather than moving against his enemies immediately, he planned an event that would send a message so clear, so terrifying, that no one would ever question his authority again. He invited the most powerful boyar families to an Easter feast at his palace in Târgoviște. These were the same people who had orchestrated his family's destruction, who had profited from the chaos that had plagued Wallachia for decades, who believed they could continue to manipulate the young prince just as they had manipulated his predecessors. The banquet hall was decorated magnificently, with the finest foods and wines laid out on tables draped in silk. The most influential nobles in Wallachia gathered in their finest clothes, no doubt discussing among themselves how they would manage their new puppet ruler. Some of them probably bragged about their roles in eliminating Vlad's father and brother. They felt safe, powerful, untouchable. They had no idea they were attending their own funeral. As the feast reached its height, Vlad rose to address his guests, but instead of the grateful speech they expected, he delivered an accusation that cut through the festive atmosphere like a blade. He announced that their shameless disunity was responsible for the constant chaos that had plagued Wallachia, that their greed and ambition had weakened the country and made it vulnerable to foreign invasion. Before anyone could react, guards surrounded the hall. What followed was not a battle or even an execution, it was a demonstration. According to multiple historical sources, approximately 500 of the most powerful nobles in Wallachia were arrested at that single feast. Those who were too old or weak to be useful were impaled immediately, their screams echoing through the palace corridors as wooden stakes were driven through their bodies. But for the rest, Vlad had something far more psychologically devastating in mind. The surviving nobles were stripped of their fine clothes and marched in chains to the construction site of Vlad's new castle. There, they were forced to work as slaves, building the very fortress that would serve as a monument to their own downfall. These men, who had lived lives of luxury, who had commanded armies and controlled the destiny of nations, were reduced to hauling stones and mixing mortar under the whips of their former servants. Many of them worked until their hands bled, until their backs broke, until they collapsed and died from exhaustion. Those who survived the construction would spend the rest of their lives as living reminders of what happened to anyone who crossed Vlad the Impaler. But the Easter massacre was just the beginning. Having eliminated the immediate threat to his rule, Vlad embarked on a campaign of terror designed to reshape not just the political landscape of Wallachia, but the very psychology of his people. He understood something that modern dictators would later rediscover: that random violence is far less effective than precisely calculated brutality. Every execution, every punishment, every display of cruelty served a specific purpose in his grand strategy of control. The method that would make him infamous throughout history was, of course, impalement. But this wasn't simply a matter of convenience or tradition. Vlad chose impalement because it was the perfect combination of psychological warfare and practical deterrent. Unlike a quick beheading or hanging, impalement was designed to maximize both the suffering of the victim and the terror of anyone who witnessed it. The process was horrifyingly systematic. A wooden or metal pole would be inserted through the victim's body, sometimes through the genitals, sometimes through the torso, carefully positioned to avoid damaging vital organs, so that death would come slowly, agonizingly, over the course of hours or even days. The pole would then be raised vertically, displaying the victim's suffering for all to see. Sometimes Vlad would have the stakes sharpened to a fine point to pierce the body quickly, but more often he preferred them rounded, forcing the victim's own weight to gradually drive the stake deeper into their flesh as they weakened. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine approaching a city and seeing hundreds or thousands of people writhing in agony on stakes, their cries carrying for miles, their bodies slowly being consumed by crows and ravens while they were still alive. This wasn't just an execution method, it was a form of psychological warfare, so effective that entire armies would turn back rather than face the possibility of such a fate. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Vlad's use of impalement was how he turned it into a form of theater. He would arrange his victims according to their social status, with the most important figures placed on the highest stakes. He would sometimes dine among the impaled, enjoying elaborate feasts while surrounded by the screams of the dying. Foreign ambassadors reported seeing him laugh and joke with his advisors, while dozens of people suffered agonizing deaths just yards away from his table. The stories of his cruelty began to spread throughout Europe like wildfire. There was the incident with the Ottoman envoys who refused to remove their turbans in his presence. Citing religious custom, Vlad's response was to nail their turbans to their heads with iron spikes, telling them he was merely helping them honor their religious devotion. There was the merchant who reported having money stolen from his cart. Vlad had the thief impaled and placed an extra coin in the merchant's cart, warning him that a second stake awaited if he failed to report the surplus. These weren't random acts of madness. They were carefully calculated demonstrations designed to establish a simple principle. In Vlad's Wallachia, there were only two types of people: those who obeyed him absolutely and those who suffered consequences so terrible that others would spend the rest of their lives ensuring they never joined their ranks. But as his reputation for brutality spread, so did his effectiveness as a ruler. Crime virtually disappeared from Wallachia. Corruption among officials became non-existent. Foreign merchants began to trust that their goods would be safe on Wallachian roads. The constant civil wars that had plagued the region for decades came to an abrupt end. Through pure terror, Vlad had created a stability that previous rulers had been unable to achieve through diplomacy or traditional governance. Yet this reign of terror was building towards something far more ambitious than mere domestic control. Because while Vlad was consolidating his power at home, the Ottoman Empire was preparing for what they believed would be the final conquest of Wallachia. Sultan Mehmed II, the same man who had conquered Constantinople and ended the Byzantine Empire, was assembling the largest army ever seen in the region. He had over 150,000 soldiers, cannons capable of destroying any fortress, and the confidence that came from decades of uninterrupted victory. What Mehmed didn't realize was that he wasn't just marching against another Balkan principality. He was about to face a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this exact moment. A ruler who understood that conventional warfare would mean certain defeat, and who was about to unleash a campaign of psychological and physical brutality so extreme that it would shake the Ottoman Empire to its very foundations. The Ottoman invasion of 1462 began like so many others had before it, with overwhelming confidence and the expectation of swift victory. Sultan Mehmed II had good reason for this confidence. This was the same military machine that had crushed the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire, that had reduced the legendary walls of Constantinople to rubble, that had swept across the Balkans like an unstoppable tide of conquest. His army numbered at least 150,000 men, possibly more, veteran janissaries, elite cavalry units, engineers capable of building siege equipment that could breach any fortress, and artillery that could reduce stone walls to dust. Against this massive force, Vlad could muster perhaps 30,000 soldiers, most of them peasant conscripts with minimal training and outdated equipment. By every measure of conventional military wisdom, this should have been a massacre. The Ottomans expected to march through Wallachia, capture or kill Vlad, and add another province to their ever-expanding empire. What they encountered instead was something that military historians still study today, a masterclass in asymmetric warfare that would redefine how smaller forces could resist seemingly invincible empires. Vlad understood immediately that he could not win a traditional battle. His forces were outnumbered at least 5 to 1, and the Ottoman military was the most professional and experienced in the world at that time. But he also understood something that his enemies had failed to grasp, that warfare isn't just about soldiers and weapons. It's about psychology, logistics, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to achieve victory, regardless of the moral cost. The campaign that followed would demonstrate the full scope of Vlad's tactical genius and his complete disregard for the conventional rules of warfare. As the Ottoman army advanced into Wallachia, they found a land that seemed to have been abandoned by its inhabitants. Villages stood empty, their houses intact but devoid of people. Wells had been poisoned with rotting corpses. Crops had been burned in the fields. Livestock had been driven away or slaughtered, their carcasses left to rot and spread disease. This was scorched earth warfare, taken to an extreme that shocked, even hardened Ottoman veterans. Vlad had evacuated virtually the entire population of southern Wallachia, forcing his own people to abandon their homes and flee to the mountains with whatever possessions they could carry. Those who couldn't make the journey, the sick, the elderly, anyone who might slow down the evacuation, were killed rather than allowed to fall into Ottoman hands, where they might be forced to reveal information about Wallachian defenses. But the psychological warfare was just beginning. As the Ottoman army struggled through the depopulated countryside, they began encountering Vlad's signature calling card, forests of impaled corpses. These weren't random displays of violence. They were carefully orchestrated psychological operations designed to demoralize the invading forces. The bodies were arranged to maximize their visual impact. with the most prominent figures mounted on the highest stakes. Many of the corpses were Ottoman prisoners from previous raids, dressed in Turkish uniforms, so that the advancing soldiers would know exactly what fate awaited them if they were captured. The smell alone was devastating. Thousands of rotting bodies in the summer heat created a stench that could be detected from miles away. The buzzing of flies was so loud it could be heard over the sound of marching boots. Crows and ravens, grown fat from feeding on human flesh, would circle overhead in massive flocks, their cries adding to the apocalyptic atmosphere. Ottoman soldiers, men who had seen combat across 3 continents, began to desert in large numbers, rather than continue advancing through what they described as a landscape from hell itself. But Vlad's most innovative tactic was what modern military strategists would recognize as biological warfare. He systematically gathered people suffering from deadly diseases, leprosy, tuberculosis, bubonic plague, and sent them to wander into the Ottoman camp. These walking plague carriers would present themselves as refugees or deserters begging for food and shelter, all while carrying pathogens that would spread rapidly through the densely packed military formations. The results were catastrophic for the Ottoman forces. Within days of entering Wallachia, plague had begun spreading through their ranks. Soldiers who had survived battles across Europe were dying not from sword wounds or arrow strikes, but from diseases they had contracted from seemingly harmless civilians. The Ottoman army, designed for rapid movement and decisive battles, found itself bogged down by an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't fight. As the demoralized and disease-ridden Ottoman forces struggled toward the Wallachian capital of Târgoviște, Vlad prepared his masterpiece, an attack so audacious, so perfectly timed, and so psychologically devastating that it would be remembered as one of the greatest military operations in medieval history. The night attack of the 17th of June 1462 would demonstrate not just Vlad's tactical brilliance, but his absolute commitment to victory, regardless of the risks involved. Vlad had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering intelligence about Ottoman movements, studying their camp layouts, and training a select group of his most loyal soldiers for what was essentially a suicide mission. The plan was simple in concept, but extraordinarily difficult in execution. They would infiltrate the Ottoman camp under cover of darkness and attempt to assassinate Sultan Mehmed II himself. The audacity of this plan cannot be overstated. Vlad was proposing to attack the largest military force in the world, in their own camp, surrounded by their own guards, with the goal of killing the most powerful ruler in Europe. The odds of success were virtually non-existent, and the consequences of failure would be the complete destruction of Wallachia and the torture and execution of everyone involved. But Vlad understood something that his enemies did not. Sometimes the most desperate situations require the most desperate measures. As midnight approached on June 17, Vlad and approximately 1,000 of his most elite cavalry moved silently through the darkness toward the Ottoman camp. They had spent hours studying the camp's layout, identifying the location of Mehmed's tent, and planning their approach routes. Vlad himself had disguised himself as a Turkish soldier, using his knowledge of Ottoman language and customs acquired during his years as a hostage to blend in with the enemy forces. The attack began with a deception that would have impressed the most skilled intelligence operatives of any era. Vlad rode boldly up to the main gate of the Ottoman camp and, speaking perfect Turkish, ordered the guards to open it immediately. In the darkness and confusion, with thousands of soldiers moving around the camp, the guards assumed he was a Turkish officer returning from a patrol. By the time they realized their mistake, Vlad and his cavalry were already inside the camp. What followed was chaos on a scale that defied description. Flaming torches were thrust into tents and supply wagons, creating an inferno that lit up the night sky. Wallachian cavalry charged through the camp, cutting down anyone who stood in their way, targeting not just soldiers but also horses, camels, and supply animals. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Ottoman soldiers, awakened from sleep by screaming and the smell of smoke, had no idea what was happening or where the attacks were coming from. In the darkness and confusion, Ottoman units began attacking each other, mistaking their own soldiers for Wallachian infiltrators. The sound of Turkish being spoken was no guarantee of safety, since many of Vlad's men had learned the language during previous conflicts. The result was a massacre that claimed thousands of Ottoman lives, most of them killed not by Wallachian weapons, but by their own confused comrades. Vlad himself, accompanied by his personal bodyguard, drove straight toward the center of the camp, where intelligence had indicated Sultan Mehmed's tent was located. For a few terrifying moments, it seemed as though the impossible might actually happen, that a minor Balkan prince might succeed in assassinating the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. But when they reached the tent, they found it empty. Mehmed, either through luck or intelligence of his own, had moved his sleeping quarters to a different location. The assassination attempt had failed, but the psychological damage to Ottoman morale was incalculable. The most powerful military force in the world had been penetrated and attacked in their own camp by a vastly inferior enemy. Thousands of their soldiers were dead, their supplies were burning, and their animals were scattered across the countryside. Most importantly, their reputation for invincibility had been shattered by a man they had dismissed as a minor irritant. As dawn broke over the devastated Ottoman camp, Sultan Mehmed II was forced to confront a reality that no previous enemy had ever made him face, that conventional military superiority meant nothing against an opponent who was willing to abandon every rule of civilized warfare. The psychological impact of the night attack would resonate through Ottoman military planning for decades to come, but its immediate effect was to convince Mehmed that he needed to end this campaign as quickly as possible. The Ottoman army, now reduced and demoralized, continued their advance toward Târgoviște, but they were no longer the confident force that had entered Wallachia weeks earlier. They were an army that had been bloodied, diseased, and humiliated by an enemy who seemed to appear and disappear like a nightmare. And as they approached the Wallachian capital, they were about to encounter Vlad's most infamous creation, to the Sceau, a display of mass murder so extensive and so horrifying that it would haunt the Ottoman Empire for generations and cement Vlad's reputation as the most terrifying ruler in European history. The forest of the Impaled awaited them, and nothing in their military experience had prepared them for what they were about to see. When the Ottoman army finally reached the outskirts of Târgoviște on the 22nd of June 1462, they expected to find a typical medieval capital. Stone walls, defensive towers, perhaps a few hundred defenders making a last desperate stand. What they discovered instead was something that would be seared into the collective memory of the Ottoman Empire for centuries to come. It was a sight so horrific, so monumentally cruel, that even Sultan Mehmed II, a man who had personally ordered the massacre of thousands during the siege of Constantinople, would be moved to retreat in absolute horror. The road leading to the capital was lined with stakes stretching as far as the eye could see. But these weren't empty wooden poles or symbolic warnings. Each stake held a human being in various stages of decay, their bodies twisted in the final agonies of impalement, their faces frozen in expressions of unimaginable suffering. The scale was beyond anything the Ottomans had ever encountered. Thousands upon thousands of corpses arranged in perfect rows, creating what witnesses described as a forest of the dead. But Vlad's genius for psychological warfare extended far beyond mere numbers. He had arranged his victims according to a precise hierarchy of terror designed to maximize the psychological impact on his enemies. At the very center of this macabre display, mounted on the highest stake of all, was the rotting corpse of Hamza Pasha, one of the most respected Ottoman military commanders. His body had been placed at the peak not just as a symbol of his former rank, but as a clear message to every Ottoman soldier: no matter how high your position, no matter how many victories you've won, this is what awaits you in Wallachia. The stench was indescribable. Thousands of decomposing bodies in the summer heat had created an atmosphere so toxic that Ottoman soldiers were vomiting and fainting before they even got close to the capital. The sound was equally horrifying. The constant buzzing of millions of flies feeding on human flesh, the creaking of wooden stakes swaying in the breeze, and the otherworldly cries of massive flocks of crows and ravens that had grown so fat from their feast that they could barely fly. Contemporary Ottoman chroniclers struggled to find words adequate to describe what they witnessed. Tursun Beg wrote that the army marched for half an hour through this corridor of death, with impaled corpses stretching 60 miles in every direction. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. These were veteran soldiers who had fought in dozens of campaigns, men who had seen the worst that medieval warfare could offer, and they were breaking down in tears at the sight of what one human being could do to thousands of others. Sultan Mehmed II himself, when he finally came face to face with Vlad's creation, was so shaken that he immediately ordered his army to halt their advance. According to the Byzantine historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles, the Sultan's reaction was one of genuine awe mixed with horror. He reportedly said that it was impossible to defeat a man who understood governance and warfare on such a diabolical level, and that anyone capable of such acts was worth far more than any territory they might conquer. But the Forest of the Impaled wasn't just a display of past victories, it was a promise of what would happen to any Ottoman soldier who fell into Wallachian hands. Every man in Mehmed's army understood that if they continued this campaign, if they were wounded and captured, if they fell behind during a retreat, they would join the thousands of their comrades already decorating the approaches to Târgoviște. The psychological pressure was so intense that entire units began to mutiny, refusing to advance any further into what they had come to see as a cursed land. And so we reach the end of Vlad the Impaler's story. A tale that proves reality can be far more terrifying than any fiction. From a traumatized child hostage to the most feared ruler in medieval Europe, Vlad transformed psychological warfare into an art form that literally changed the course of history. His methods were brutal beyond imagination, but they achieved something no other ruler of his time could accomplish. He forced the mighty Ottoman Empire to retreat through sheer terror alone. Today, while Bram Stoker's vampire drinks blood in our nightmares, the real Dracula's legacy reminds us that the most monstrous acts in history were committed not by fictional creatures, but by human beings who understood that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a sword or cannon, it's fear itself.